This is Jeremiah Pfeiffer, and you're listening to Science from the Source. In today's episode, we discuss the Masters athlete and recovery as I speak with early career researcher Nattai Borges from Newcastle University and Tom Doering from Bonn University. In this episode, Tom outlines his findings from his 2016 paper, Lower Integrated Muscle Protein Synthesis in Masters Compared with Younger Athletes, which was published in Medicine and Science and Sport and Exercise. While Nattai discusses his paper, Age-Related Changes in Physical and Perceptual Markers of Recovery Following High-Intensity Interval Cycle Exercise. This paper was published in Experimental Aging Research in 2017. Then we discuss how these findings may be useful to current Masters athletes and what areas of research are still needed. Nattai and Tom join me today via Zencastr. Nattai and Tom, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
No problem. Hey, and so this is going to be the first episode that I've ever recorded where we are interviewing two people at once. And so my guess is it's not going to work out well, but we'll try to get there. Today, we're going to be talking to Nattai and Tom, and you are both graduates of Central Queensland University. And you both were in the School of Medical and Applied Sciences, and both of you worked within the area of aging and recovery, Masters athletes. And so in today's show, we're going to talk a bit about your thesis or the area of research. And specifically, we're going to talk about a couple papers that you've written. One in 2016, Tom, your paper, Lower Integrated Muscle Protein Synthesis and Masters Compared with Younger Athletes. And Nattai, your paper that was published in Experimental Aging Research in 2017, which was titled Age-Related Changes in Physical and Perceptual Markers of Recovery Following High-Intensity Interval Cycling or Cycle Exercise. So to start off, I guess the simplest question from me is that each of you are fairly young. Is that correct?
Relatively, I guess.
Yeah. So you're not a Masters athlete yourself?
Not yet.
That's right. So I am. So I'm 40 years old, and so that means that every day I get up in the morning. After training, I feel sore. I don't sleep well, and I'm just old and angry as always. So the question, I guess, that we want to start off with is, why did you choose this area of research? And so you both did PhDs within the same area, within Masters athletes. Why, as young, healthy, happy adult males, did you choose to research old, aging Masters athletes? And Nattai, if you want to start off and kind of give an idea around that first, would be great.
Yeah, sure. To be honest, I didn't really know. I don't really know why I chose to look into Masters athletes. I think both of Tom and I had the same supervisor who his name is Professor Peter Rayburn, and he's a crazy Masters athlete. He's really into it, and it's quite infectious. You know, his love for Masters sport, and he kind of got me into it. And at the time when I started, I wasn't really a topic that I was super into. But I guess as most PhDs, as you go along, as you start to read, you become really invested in the topic, and just became more and more interested as I went along. So yeah, I didn't really start with a specific interest in aging or older athletes, but just one of those things that once I started, Pete's attitude was quite infectious, and then it just grew from there.
And Tom?
Oh, I'm on. I'd say similar. We were I think we're very lucky to be a part of Pete's group. Pete had a group at the time of maybe 8 of us, I think, on Masters athlete related research, and I think we're also very lucky in that he was very generous of how the projects went. We kind of had limited guidelines, and although it was around Masters athletes, we kind of determined the rest. And hence I went down the nutrition pathway and recovery, Nattai recovery, and so on. So we were given a lot of freedom. But then I guess it turned, as Nattai said, it turned into a kind of thing we both became really interested in. I think we've been chatting recently about, trying to continue some of this research. It's an interesting area, and it's certainly growing.
And so are both of you working in this area still?
Not so much. I mean, I have a couple of projects lined up that I would like to look into, again, looking at the aging space and using Masters athletes as a model, I guess, for physically active older adults, but nothing currently in the works.
Yeah, I would say similar. My postdoc has taken me slightly away from masters athletes for the last 2 years, but as mentioned, it's certainly something that I'd like to come back to. There's certainly an area for it in Australia. There's growing masters athletes competitions in Australia and worldwide, so I think it's certainly an area that people are interested in, and will continue to be interested in.
So it sounds like then that you both were thrust into the Masters Athletes area because Peter wanted to somehow further his master's career.
Correct.
So you're using your research to be a better athlete. That's pretty much what I do with my students. So always nice. Now, when working with Masters athletes, though, I always found it to be a little bit different than when you work with a young, let's use cyclists for example. I always found Masters athletes to be a bit more engaging and willing to take part in a lot of quite invasive based research. Is that something you noticed too?
100%, I think. So I had a comparison. I think we both had comparison groups of older and younger athletes, and I found it a lot easier to recruit the older athletes than the younger athletes.
And also, did you find that most of the individuals who engage with your research are also just interested in the fact that, as we age, our bodies essentially start failing from birth, and the less they fail, the slower they fail, the longer you get to live. And so, did you find that your subjects were quite interested in that aspect, or were they only really just interested in getting faster and getting stronger?
I would say they're interested in getting faster. We're talking guys. I think both Nattai and I both had mean ages of around 50 years of age. But these guys were competing in, Ironman Australia, events like that. They were solely focused on getting faster, and they're very committed to their sport. Like I would say, as committed or probably more committed than younger athletes. They maybe have a little bit more time on their hands at that age. Maybe have a little bit more money to invest in performance, their own performance. So I think they're very receptive, and they're just keen to get faster and better.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think, although we did look at masters athletes, they're not really classified as older adults because, like Tom said, the mean ages were about 55 for the older group. So I think maybe if we looked at kind of an older group of masters athletes, maybe 65 plus years of age, and maybe their motivations might be slightly different, less kind of focused on performance and potentially more focused on the aging aspects and aging successfully, but probably hard to kind of say that at the moment without doing a little bit more research in the area.
Yeah, I've done a bit of research with masters, and I always found the benefit to working with masters athletes is that they tend to be able to come to your labs whenever you want. You can have them come in at noon, and for some reason it seems like they they have jobs, but it seems like they never actually go to their jobs. So I always found that to be a quite appealing part of working with masters athletes as opposed to younger guys who might be a little bit earlier on in the career and less likely to come into the lab when you want.
Were they cyclists, Jeremiah?
They were, yes.
I found all the cyclists always wanted to come to the lab at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Well, I think that's just something bizarre about Australia because coming from the U.S., we don't ride our bikes before the sun comes up, and so I don't understand why that's something that people want to do here. But it's I've always found that master athletes are quite engaged in terms of the actual research you're doing, as well as they're interested in the outcomes.
Yeah, certainly agree.
Yeah, they're a great cohort, I think, for research. Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about each of your studies first, and then we're going to kind of go into more of a general discussion about what it means and what your studies together kind of mean for an older athlete. And so, again, we call it masters athletes, but technically that starts at 35 years old. So once you're 35, you can compete in masters categories for a lot of different disciplines. And so at 55, you're kind of mid in that masters area. And Tom, you completed a paper called, again, lower integrated muscle protein synthesis in masters compared with younger athletes. And Nattai, again, yours was age-related changes in physical and perceptual markers of recovery following high-intensity interval cycle exercise. What I would like, just before we kick off the conversation, is for each of you to kind of go through your paper itself and give kind of a rationale why you undertook the research, and then what it is you did, and then, of course, what were the findings from those papers. So, Tom, if you want to start off on this one.
Sure, no problems. So a previous study to this particular one that we're going to have a bit of a talk about, I did a bit of a survey-based paper to look at or try to figure out what do masters athletes know about recovery nutrition and what do they typically have post-exercise in a post-exercise meal or snack. And ultimately what we found in that prior study was that they have in their post-exercise snack typically around 20 grams of protein, which is around the sport nutrition guidelines. And they have carbohydrate at a reasonable amount for a masters athlete, around 0.7 grams per kilo in their first snack. So that's fine. And we thought, well, that's all great. And it lines up with the sport nutrition guidelines. But there's prior research out there that shows that not necessarily in masters athletes, but in older populations, that muscle protein synthesis, or to maximize the muscle protein synthesis response, requires higher amounts of protein typically in people around that 50 and beyond years of age. So we wanted to test whether having the amount of protein recommended by current sport nutrition guidelines for younger athletes was appropriate for older athletes. So that's where this particular study came around.
Tom, is there a reason why an older adult might require more protein for that kind of muscle regeneration?
Yeah, sure. There's a process of what we call anabolic resistance to protein intake, and it seems to come into effect, I guess. We don't really know when, but it seems prominent around that 40, 50 years of age when we start to see that decline in muscle mass that corresponds with that kind of age. And it's multifactorial. The causes to the anabolic resistance, but there's certainly an intramuscular effect whereby the signaling responses to protein are lowered or dampened with older age, and we tend to see a lower response for a given amount of protein in an older compared to younger person.
Just with the loss of muscle, is there, people who are listening to this might be aware of type 1, type 2 muscle fibers. Is there a muscle fiber that's more susceptible to that loss as we age?
Yeah, it seems to be the type 2 muscle fibers that are more susceptible to that, the explosive or fast twitch fibers, which we might suggest are obviously not as important to endurance performance, but we wanted to test overall in mixed muscle, whole muscle. We're not at that fiber level where we can differentiate the protein synthesis in those separate fibers in muscle in our particular study. So we want to know, well, is there an anabolic resistance that persists in these older athletes, or is it just because the general population is maybe not as active as they once were, or is it aging per se that's the issue?
Okay, and so what did you do to test it out?
So we did a 72-hour intervention whereby I'll go back one step, sorry. I guess in a prior review of literature, we seem to think that following muscle-damaging exercise is when masters athletes maybe take a little longer to recover. If there's something in this recovery thing in masters athletes, we think that it's following muscle damage. So we did a 72-hour intervention whereby we had a group of masters and a group of young athletes, and we were a little mean. We gave them a 30-minute downhill run at a negative 10% gradient to induce some eccentric muscle damage to kick off that kind of event, if you like. And following that, we gave them multiple 20-kilometre cycling time trials at 10 hours post that downhill run, 24 hours post that downhill run, and 48 hours post that downhill run to look at kind of a time course in recovery of performance. And each of those time trials were compared to a baseline time trial that was completed prior to that muscle damage or prior to this 72-hour event. And as well, what we did was take a muscle biopsy sample before and also after at 72 hours. So after that, 1 day after that 48-hour time trial, we took a muscle sample then and we looked at the rate of protein turnover or synthesis in our older guys or masters guys compared to our younger guys to see if there was any effect there.
I think I might have missed it. Did you use triathletes for this?
Yeah, correct. We used
okay, so you're using
masters triathletes. Sorry.
So they were pretty accustomed to both running and cycling. So you weren't using an unaccustomed exercise, even though no one runs downhill for 30 minutes at gradient normally. But they would at least be accustomed to the exercise itself.
Correct, yeah.
And then, so what did you do with those? What did you find?
Yeah, so when we had a look at the data at the end, and we saw that following the muscle damaging run, we see a decline in exercise performance in the cycling time trial that was probably more pronounced in the Masters guys, around 3% decrease in performance compared to their baseline. And then we seem to see both the groups come back relatively quickly, even the Masters guys, but it was that 10 hours after exercise, or that same day exercise performance, that seemed to be a little compromised. So that was our first finding in regards to our performance. In regards to the protein synthesis rate, we found that the Masters athletes had a lower protein synthesis rate over that whole 3-day period, which incorporated all those exercise bouts and all the nutrition involved over that 72-hour period compared to the younger guys. So it was a very large effect, the difference between the two. So we think there's still something in that anabolic resistance, even though these guys are really well trained from memory. We've got a VO2 of around 55 mils in these Masters athletes, so they're reasonably well-trained guys. So it's maybe not about the training status of the person. Maybe it is something about aging. The muscle becomes less responsive to protein intake.
And this, of course, was protein intake. You were taking 20 grams of protein, which is the recommended amount for a younger athlete. Is that correct?
Correct. So one of the things that we identified early on in the review of the PhD process was that there's no real guidelines for Masters athletes. We have guidelines, really well-developed guidelines for athletes in general, but they're not specific to an older population. And maybe in terms of carbohydrate, unless there's some underlying metabolic issue, there's maybe no need to differentiate. But I think with protein, maybe there is, because there's sufficient research out there to suggest that in at least older untrained people that, there's something going on in that anabolic resistance space.
Okay, so in your paper, you showed that after doing a muscle damaging exercise, so downhill running, you had an impact on cycling performance, which is essentially concentric exercise at 10 hours. And that sort of came back around 24 and 48 hours for masters and younger adults. But you then said you observed some differences in protein synthesis at 48 hours. And so there might be some delayed muscle repairing going on within the older adults that you don't have to worry about in our younger athletes. Is that correct?
Potentially, yeah. So that, just to clarify, that protein synthetic rate is an integrated rate, if you like. So it incorporates that whole 3-day period. So traditionally, muscle protein synthesis, or the rate of muscle protein building, was only measured over relatively short periods of time in the laboratory. Whereas with this kind of newer technique, we're able to measure that over much longer time frames. And as I mentioned, that incorporates then exercise and nutrition over multiple days. So that lower rate is incorporated over that whole 72-hour period.
Okay. And Nattai, you took a different approach. So you weren't destroying your subjects' legs with downhill running. You had them come in and do some high-intensity interval training. And so maybe if you can now talk about your study a bit, again, why did you do it in the first place, what it is that you undertook, and then what your outcomes were.
Yeah, sure. So like Tom said earlier, I think, the whole space of recovery for Masters athletes is something that there's not a lot of information in the research at the moment. So we really had kind of an open book to kind of investigate what we really wanted to. At the time when we just started, there was a couple of papers that had come out looking at recovery between younger and older athletes, mainly after kind of endurance-based exercise. So where Tom kind of decided to look at a stimulus that might elicit muscle damage, I thought, well, what about kind of the high-intensity realm, and whether maybe the high levels of metabolic stress might lead to, again, maybe a difference in the recovery rates for the younger and older athletes, which is something that I hadn't seen in the literature at the time. So, we decided to base our exercise protocol more off a high-intensity interval protocol, so looking at kind of 6 30-second efforts at about 175% of peak power output. So although you say we didn't torture the athletes, it was actually a pretty hard protocol.
And interval training would be something that's quite highly utilized within the masters groups, especially those who are still being competitive. So this isn't something that would be abnormal for someone to undertake. You're not using a stimulus, even though, and yes, doing 6 by 30 at 175% is pretty difficult, but this would be something that maybe you would find an athlete actually doing within a training program?
Yeah, sure. I think like a serious endurance athlete would would be utilizing high intensity interval work. I did find with a lot of the athletes that we had in my study anyway, a lot of them were kind of road warriors where they spent a lot of time doing road rides, and they didn't particularly like the high intensity work. So for them, I think the athletes really got something out of it, and they kind of had to push themselves a bit in a different way than I think they usually would.
And why did you choose 6 by 30 seconds? So, I mean, we know, well, there's a myriad of different interval efforts you can undertake, and some work has been shown to demonstrate that these 30-second efforts are quite good, but also much longer efforts, the 4 to 8 minute efforts in terms of sustained power. So why these efforts as your, I guess, fatiguing or so your fatiguing protocol? Why use these as opposed to much longer efforts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I've got a great answer for that. Literally, I was just trying to find something that had been done before in the research or in the literature to kind of back up the protocol that I was proposing. I decided I wanted to go something relatively short but relatively intense because I really wanted to push the athletes to see whether we might be able to elicit a different response in recovery. So rather than going for something a little bit longer at a lower intensity, really ramping up that intensity to see if that could inflict the highest amount of metabolic stress and seeing if that might have an effect on the recovery rates.
Okay, and because my understanding from your paper is that most of the research that's looked at master's recovery has been usually in much longer ultra endurance based events, so prolonged running and such. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there was a paper done on a trail run, which was an ultra endurance event, and there was a couple of papers that had looked at subsequent 30-minute time trials on consecutive days. So that was kind of the only real literature in masters athletes at the time, I believe. I know Tommy might remember some other papers, but from my memory, it was mainly based around that endurance style or any endurance exercise effort. So I was really looking to kind of do something a little bit different, and being more of a team sport athlete myself, I always prefer doing high intensity work, so I find it a little bit more interesting. So it could have been a little bit of a selfish desire as well.
That's fair. So what is it that you actually then did? So you had them do these efforts, and then what?
Yeah, so basically after we did a whole bunch of baseline testing, we put them through the exercise protocol, which was the 6 by 30 second efforts with about 4.5 minutes rest between each effort. So they were pretty much efforts every 5 minutes. And then what we did is we got them directly off the bike and put them through an acute recovery phase, which was about 40 minutes of supine recovery, so laying down. And then we kind of monitored their recovery over the next 48 hours. So an hour after the cessation of exercise, we got them back up and we put them through some performance tests. So we did a isometric maximal voluntary contraction to look at muscle strength. We looked at 10-second sprint performance to look at kind of a sport-specific measure of muscle power. And then we also did a time trial, but that wasn't until the 48-hour post mark. So basically after the cessation of exercise at 2 hours, 24 hours, and 48 hours post exercise, we got them back in to do the perceptual tests, the performance tests. We also got blood measures measures of blood to look at creatine kinase to look at whether we elicited any muscle damage. And then we also had a number of perceptual questionnaires looking at their perceived recovery, fatigue, motivation, and also muscle soreness. So, yeah, we've monitored them over the 24 hours and mapped it all out.
And so over 24 hours, you collected most of your measures over that time period and then had that time trial at the 48 hours. Why is that 24-hour period so important?
We just kind of wanted to keep them coming in. We wanted to look at the 24-hour point because there was a paper in the paper was written by a group in France by East Hope, I believe was the author, and they found out 24 hours post after the trail run, they noticed a delay in recovery in the masters athletes, in particular looking at muscle strength. So we wanted to test that same time point and see if we could find something similar. But also we wanted to kind of stretch it out to 48 hours, because that's generally the time frame for recovery when we're looking at whether we have muscle damage. Ideally, we would have liked to have pushed it out to 72 hours, so 3 days, but obviously we had time constraints, and being a PhD, we didn't have a lot of funding. So we had to cut it back to the 48 hours.
So what did you find?
Yeah, so we had some pretty interesting findings that kind of actually support what the findings that are currently out there with some of the endurance results. So basically with the performance measures, we didn't see a difference between the two groups. So both groups showed a reduction in performance at that kind of 1 hour post exercise cessation. But pretty much they both recovered, fatigued and recovered at the same rate, looking at the performance measures. So we didn't see a difference in performance recovery between the masters and the young. And we didn't see really a sharp increase in creatine kinase. So we are suggesting that there wasn't a lot of muscle damage elicited by the high intensity interval session. But looking at the perceptual markers, we actually saw quite a big difference between the younger and the older athletes. And this is something, again, that has been reported before in previous literature. So we saw that at the 48-hour post-exercise mark, that the masters athletes had lower motivation to exercise. They were reporting high levels of fatigue and also high levels of muscle soreness. So we didn't really see any differences in performance recovery, but we saw changes in the perceptual recovery. And again, this has been shown in other papers as well, where they've shown a restoration in performance in the masters athletes, but they are still reporting higher levels of fatigue and lower levels of perceived recovery.
And what do you think it is that's causing that then?
That's a great question, Jeremiah. If you figure it out, let us know.
That's fair.
So I guess, yeah, I don't really know. Tommy, do you have any ideas, mate?
No, I think there's been a bit of research that's looked into this, and like Nattai said, we've all seen similar things, but to date we're really not sure why. And we were discussing this before, actually. It's a hard thing to study, and how do you really study it to find out the answer? So it's a tough one, and we unfortunately don't have the answers at the minute.
I wouldn't even know where to start, really. I mean, there could be so many potential influencing factors. So
yeah, I'm wondering if it's. I mean, I don't know either, and so I'm just thinking. You're looking at kind of this connection between physiological and psychological outcomes, and of course, we're sports scientists, so we know nothing about psychology. So I won't even begin to try to think I do. But I'm wondering whether it has something to do with some of the protein synthesis rates or the changes in substrate utilization that might occur after exercise in masters athletes. And knowing that our brain is highly glucose hungry, I'm just wondering whether some of the changes in protein synthesis and the systems behind that and the work that's necessary for that to happen might be driving some of those changes. But yeah, I have no clue.
Yeah, so Tom's the nutrition expert. I think.
Yeah, well, there's been some research to look at protein and how if it does influence muscle soreness or fatigue, but the literature is kind of all over the place on that. So there's no consensus whether dietary protein does have an effect on muscle soreness. And, it's probably leaning towards no, but whether that's the same in masters athletes, we don't really know. In terms of, you mentioned protein synthesis, we found it was lower in these masters athletes. We know protein synthesis is an active process. It requires energy and ATP. So maybe it's something around that. But again, if you think around masters athletes and are they fueling appropriately or enough, then most of them probably are. If you look at their body composition and what they're actually fueling, their body composition maybe isn't as lean as some younger athletes. So the amount of energy that they're consuming relative to their lean mass is probably appropriate. So I don't know. That is certainly something to look at potentially, but I'm not sure around that process or if that's something to consider in the future.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an interesting topic. I mean, I some of the stuff that we research here in terms of cognition and some of the theories we have around, aging and mitochondria being dysfunctional. So again, the powerhouse of your cell producing most of the ATP tends to be slightly dysfunctional as we get older, and some of the transcription, or as we make more mitochondria, we start to make poor mitochondria, I guess is the best way to use. And so that's always just my thought, is whether or not it's kind of the higher energy output that's necessary to maintain function in older adults that causes this kind of prolonged recovery rates for athletes, or for anybody for that matter, doing any type of physical activity.
Yeah, I think it's important to note as well that a lot of these studies these are just acute training or an acute intervention. So although we're not seeing, particularly in my paper, although we didn't see any real difference in the performance markers, if we extend this out to maybe a 3 month block, who's not to say that the over time we might see a difference in that performance recovery.
Yeah, I guess that's a really important point to make here. And so we're all talking about recovery at the moment, and not one of us yet has defined what that actually means. And I think that's really an important aspect within almost all recovery-based research. So what do you, when you talk about recovery, what is it what would you say is full recovery for someone then? So if you're talking to an athlete and they're a master's athlete, you say, well, look, at 3 days, you might not have you might not be fully recovered. What is your definition of full recovery?
Yes, I mean, I think generally when you talk about recovery with an athlete, it usually revolves around performance recovery. So whether your force production has been restored, whether you're able to kick out the same amount of watts on the bike. But again, recovery, it's multifactorial as well. So we could look at recovery in a number of different ways, and you can look at heart rate, you can look at physiological recovery, you can look at perceptual recovery. But I would say generally, when you're discussing recovery with an athlete, it usually just revolves around performance recovery, which generally tends to happen within the next 24, 48 hours after exercise, depending obviously on the intensity of the exercise and nutrition and sleep and other factors like that.
I would agree. I would say typically we talk around performance recovery, if you like. As Nattai mentioned, getting back to that same baseline performance outcome. But I think Nattai and I are probably both on the same page in terms of if you're working with masters athletes, as Nattai's just talked about, the perceptual recovery is really important, maybe more so important in that particular cohort. There was a nice review in 2015 that looked at perceptual, using perceptual markers in training load monitoring and found it really effective. And I think that's something that you could really utilize in masters athletes as well. And maybe it's even more important given, our findings look like masters athletes perceive recovery to be worse, but that's also been shown back in 2008 by James Fell and colleagues. So I think that's something that that you could really use in a masters athlete cohort if you're coaching in a practical sense.
Yeah, just following up on that, I think it's really important to monitor some of these psychological or perceptual measures of fatigue and recovery. Particularly, again, if we extrapolate this information from a 2-day or 3-day study to a whole training block, obviously it could have downstream effects on participation and adherence to training. So again, we could have a long-term effect on the overall adaptation and increases in performance due to training.
Yeah, and that's something I was just thinking about with both of your papers. So we're talking about recovery over up to 48 hours, and both of you are showing relatively decent recovery at the 48-hour time point. Again, Tom, in your paper, the protein synthesis rates may not have been fully recovered at 48 hours, but the performance was. But Nattai, with that psychological aspect, that's I think a really important point is that if we're prescribing exercise and we're coaching athletes or we're giving guidelines, it's only so much we can do in terms of telling people to do exercise. If they feel fatigued and they feel tired, they're less likely to do the exercise we ask them to do. And so, and this is something. I mean, I'm 40 years old. I do not recover like I did when I was 20. I can only imagine that's going to get worse. And there are days when I'm on the bike doing efforts, and I know I should do a fourth effort, and I feel tired, and I don't do a fourth effort. And I think maybe that when we talk about recovery, at least in my opinion, we need to be looking at both the physical recovery as well as the psychological recovery. And across long duration chronic training blocks, I know that's not always possible, but I think then your two outcomes become quite important, because what you're saying is that for masters athletes, that kind of full body recovery might not happen for 48 hours.
Yeah.
So if you extend this now, you both said they're acute trials, so you didn't want to make any prolonged extensions, but now I'm going to ask you to do that anyway. So what do you think? So each of your studies, you looked at this on an acute base level. What do you think the chronic implications are for athletes with each of your outcomes independent? So, Tom, if you want to kick off with that.
Yeah, sure. I think, like we talked about at the start, we implemented in this particular study over the 48, 72 hours, we implemented nutrition that was optimal for younger athletes in terms of protein intake. So I think protein intake needs to be something that's considered by masters athletes. And of course, as with any athlete, the nutrition that you provide at certain times has to be taken into context. So what's the next session? When is the next session? What's it going to be? And that might dictate how you approach your nutrition. But I think protein is certainly something to be considered or at least thought about. And maybe 20 grams for a masters athlete isn't quite enough. We've kind of moved towards using relative amounts of protein or dosing on a relative per kg of body mass basis. And in younger adults, we look at around 0.25 grams per kilo of protein to be consumed. There's a nice meta-analysis review by Dan Moore that looks at, even in untrained older people, however, that they might need somewhere up around 0.4 grams per kilo of body mass to maximize protein synthesis. And potentially masters athletes are somewhere in that range. They're maybe a little bit high, towards the higher end of that scale. So I think protein is certainly something to be considered. And if we implemented protein at a higher dose in that particular study in the masters guys, we might have seen similar protein synthesis rates. We've seen in the literature that protein synthesis rates in older people, they're quite capable of producing the same rates as younger people, but they need more protein to do that. So I think that's something to clarify. If they have that higher amount of protein, we might not see this effect, but we just don't know at this stage. What effect that then has on recovery from muscle damage, again, we're not quite sure yet.
Okay, and then I have two questions because I'm a terrible eater too. So everything you're telling me is highly important in terms of me trying to exercise. So if we follow those guidelines, 0.25, 0.4 per kilogram of body weight, what does that look like? So if I go home today and I think, well, I need to eat 20 grams of protein, what is that?
Yeah, sure. I think if you have a small can of tuna, I'm looking around my office furiously. If you have a small can of tuna, I think you're looking at like 15 grams of protein. Something along those lines. So something around that, you might be looking at half for a masters athlete, like that's half of your requirement, but you typically be surprised. I'll use a supplement as an example just because it's easier. Typical supplements around 25 grams. You're looking at a whey protein supplement, they're typically around that 25 grams of protein. So maybe you're looking at slightly over one serving. But again, you've got to consider what's then coming next. If you don't have another exercise bout for 24 hours, then maybe you can kind of target your protein to maximize potentially your adaptation to that prior exercise bout. But if you know you have to exercise again in 4 hours, then maybe carbohydrate provision is maybe more important to fuel yourself for the next event or next training bout.
And if you're not going to be exercising within that 24 hours, what do you reckon is the appropriate time frame to get those 20 grams of protein into yourself?
Yeah, so we think we know that protein is certainly important for adaptation. We typically think around maximizing protein synthesis and protein intake for resistance trained athletes or people that are going to the gym. But we know that it's also important for endurance trained people, and there's potentially a role in protein to help you adapt to that prior exercise bout. So I would say as soon as possible, as soon as practical. I mean, your legs aren't going to fall off if you don't have your protein straight away. But if you can get it in as soon as practical after your exercise bout, the 0.3 to 0.4 grams per kilo. There's also been some nice research, although laboratory-based, that's looked at the timing of protein across the day. So we think that maybe 3, maybe 4 boluses of that volume of protein evenly spaced across the day will maximize protein synthesis across the day, and that might be the best for adapting to those prior exercise bouts.
And Nattai, same question to you is, again, projecting out longitudinally. I'll give you an example. So I recently decided I was going to do a bunch of intervals. I was doing 10 by 1 minute intervals with a 1 minute break. And I did them on consecutive days. So I did day 1, day 2, took a break, did day 4, 5, took a break, day 7, 8. They were horrible. And as the days went on, they got worse and worse. So based on your findings, what would be your recommendation for someone who is going to undertake multiple interval sessions, which would be consistent with most masters athletes? And what should they be thinking in terms of overall recovery and performance?
So just to clarify, was your work output standardized across all of the sessions, or was it just like a sprint interval?
They were standardized. So standard work, and then the efforts were at 100% of aerobic max.
Okay, but you just they perceived worse. You perceived them to be worse and worse and worse.
Well, yeah, I would say perceived is the word. My wife was in the house, and she perceived my whimpering and whining to be worse and worse as the days went on. So yeah, they were pretty bad.
Was the swearing frequency increasing?
I think the swearing starts from interval 1 and it doesn't ever stop. So yes, they're pretty terrible.
I mean, I guess I can't really give any recommendations per se. I think it's just about being aware, and it's a bit of awareness. I think if you pre-plan and you periodize your intervals, and just having that goal will potentially help you actually finish that session and keep the quality of your training up. Because I think we've all been at that point where if we just jump on the bike and think, okay, I'm going to hit out a couple of intervals, it's very easy to just kind of back off and say, look, I'm not going to do one more because I'm not feeling great. But I think planning and periodizing out your monthly goals and your sessions really helps. I think also having a coach there with you, or even a friend, just to help with adherence is really good as well. Being accountable to other people. And I think just being aware and maybe monitoring your own perceptual well-being is a good idea. And just looking at the responses that you expect from yourself over time to see whether that is kind of changing between the sessions. It can give you a good indication of maybe whether or not you need to maybe give yourself another day or two between the next lot of interval days if you're doing successive days. But I think it's hard to say because I don't really know what influence kind of this perceptual delay may have on longer term adherence to exercise. I think the main thing is just being aware of it and monitoring it, and then making kind of an individual decision based off your own data to see whether or not it needs to, whether it's having, I guess, a negative effect on your quality of training. And if it is, then potentially we need to start looking at modifying, I guess, your periodization and your weekly scheduling of training.
That's an important point you made there. I think that for it to be something that's negative, we need to see negative outcomes in both your physical performance as well as your psychological performance. And from your findings, my take home from that was that, while you may feel bad at 48 hours and you may feel fatigued, you may feel sore, your actual physical performance is still maintained. And so the training sessions can still have that amount of quality. And you need to be aware that it's likely not a physical issue that's causing you to feel fatigued, and it's more a psychological outcome. But I guess then the more important question becomes is when do you identify that it's too much? And so, if you're going to train on those days where you're physically fatigued or mentally fatigued, but you're not physically fatigued, that's fine. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, is that we need to be monitoring both physical and the mental side. And once we start to see those changes coming together, that's an indication that maybe the training is too much, or we're reaching a point where the benefits are not going to be as apparent from the training itself.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's likely going to be an individualized response as well. So it's not a one size fits all where you can say, well, as soon as your motivation drops to this point on a Likert scale, that's going to have an influence on performance. But, I think it's just about monitoring your own data or the data of your athlete over a period of time and looking at the trends and looking how they interact with each other. And I think that'll give you the best indication of, readiness to train or when you might need to add an extra recovery day.
Great. So to the both of you, and we're getting close to the end of time here, but I just want to kind of throw out the idea. So you both published a few papers in this area, so several papers in the area of masters athletes and recovery. How much do we actually know? So how much do we really know about masters athletes, and are we doing enough in the field to understand a massively growing population of individuals participating in sport? So, they talk, especially, let's use cycling, for instance. Cycling apparently is the new golf. Everybody wants to cycle. Everybody wants to do high intensity exercise. Are we doing enough at the moment to really understand this fairly specialized population?
I feel like we could always do more, right? And I think it's just like a basic research issue, right? The more we find out, the more questions you end up digging up. So although I think we're kind of just scratching the surface, literally, I think with masters athletes, and I think as Tom will say, if you just find one small finding, it leads you to 3 or 4 different questions. So I don't think I'm not going to say we're not doing enough, but I definitely think that there's room for more.
Yeah, I agree. I think most of all the studies that we've done, unfortunately, have been relatively short term. Most of the studies in masters athletes have been relatively short term. So we don't know, as we've kind of talked about throughout this whole podcast, what's going to happen after that, week 2, 3 week, if we do training interventions and so on. How do they adapt compared to younger athletes? We're not too sure. So there's certainly scope to look at that further.
It obviously goes past the performance realm. I mean, we've pretty much discussed just performance in masters athletes, but obviously if we can understand the masters athlete better and we can get more people living more physically active or being more involved in competitive sports, then obviously that has a flow-on effect to societal health and other factors like that. So I think it's something that I think we really should be dedicating more time to understanding.
I think also that the masters athlete the cohorts that we're talking about need to be defined as well. Like, we were just having a look through as a Ironman triathlon fan, for sure. You've got these 50-year-old guys that are completing Hawaii Ironman in just over 9 hours. Like, they're phenomenal athletes. So is that type of master athlete that we're talking about, or is it more of the weekend warrior, where there must be on a continuum somewhere between more of an elite type athlete to more of a general population? So that makes it difficult as well. Like, what are we actually studying?
You're opening a whole can of worms here. With we already have issues with what we call elite and what we don't call elite. Now we're going to have elite masters and non-elite masters. So well done.
No problem.
And even then, I think there's across sport comparisons too. I mean, Tommy alludes to the amazing, efforts of endurance-based triathletes. But then if you look at masters strength athletes, they're going to be a completely different kettle of fish, and they're going to have different maintenance of different physical capacities, and it's just a completely different population that hasn't even really been touched in the literature.
You both make important points. Right now you hear a lot about the idea that exercise is medicine, and that we should be using exercise for different disease states and for rehab and such. And masters athletes really present the optimal outcome from exercise. And so whether it's vascular health, it's cardiovascular health, it's muscular health, these athletes represent a really important part of research. And so what I'm getting at is that we need to know more about masters athletes, how their bodies react to exercise, because we're still unaware of the actual optimal dose for this exercise as medicine idea. And so you both make really, really important points in terms of our current knowledge about masters athletes, but the need for understanding what exercise and what large amounts of exercise can do for individuals' health.
Yeah, agree.
So we are now at the very end of the interview, and I'm going to ask you each one more question, and it's going to be the easiest question of the day. And the question is, so there may be up to 50 whole people who listen to this podcast, and one of those 50 people might want to contact either of you to talk about your current research or your previous research, or just some of your ideas in terms of exercise science in general. And so if someone wanted to contact you and they want to talk about your research, how would they do that? So, Tom,
Yep,
you can start.
Sure. Emails, the first port of call for sure. T Doering, DOERING at bond.edu.au, or on Twitter, Thomas M Doering, all one word. They're two good ways to get in contact.
Yeah, I would say firstly, if anyone's around the central coast of New South Wales and, you're feeling a bit thirsty and you want to buy me a beer, that's probably the best way to get onto me. We can go to the local Six Strings Brewery. That's where you'll find me.
That's a good plug.
But
I know. Do you actually own stock in the brewery? Is that what's happening here? Yeah.
They give me 50% off beers if I give them a plug. But no, seriously. So yeah, I guess email would probably be the best way to do it. So my email would just be Nattai. So that's NATTAI. Full stop. And then Borges, BORGES at newcastle.edu.au. Or also I'm on Twitter. Not so much, but if you do want to hit me up on Twitter, my tag is just Nattai Borges. So just at Nattai Borges.
Great. Well, I want to thank you both, firstly, for taking the time today to come and have a chat with me. I know we haven't solved the world's problems here, and what we have decided is that we don't really know a lot about masters athletes, and that the research that's been done, while really good, including the papers you guys have published, there's a lot more we need to know about these individuals because, of course, they are really they provide ideal evidence for the benefits of exercise with older adults. But, that's for another day. So, again, I want to thank you both for coming on, and I hope that each of you enjoyed the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jeremiah. It was great.
That concludes another episode of Science from the Source. If you enjoyed the podcast, please help support the show by telling your family and friends. If you would like to contact me to discuss the podcast or any of the content, please feel free to contact me via Twitter at Jeremiah Pfeiffer or by email at sciencefromthesource, that's all one word, @gmail.com.